This is our session on re-envisioning our language development syllabus. In the first part, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why we need to do our own work in a paradigm of orienting toward proficiency and letting language functions lead the way rather than letting the textbooks lead us forward. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about how some different custom AI tools could be used to help us to re-envision our language development syllabi. So our learning objectives are being able to integrate a functional syllabus into our course, adapting textbook chapters, adapting the plans that are built into our chapters into our units so that we can lead with functions, and using some AI tools to bring these functions to the foreground. So there are many weaknesses of using our pre-existing textbooks as our curriculum guide. There's lots of good reasons to use textbooks. They have great practices, they have great materials, interesting readings. It does give students something to have sort of in their hands physically to work on and to work through. But most of the time, the textbooks are kind of an ill fit for our context in the summer language school. In the language schools, we have a 7 or 8 week framework. And so each week of the language schools is often meant to cover 2 or 3 chapters, sometimes in textbooks. And that can be an awkward fit. It's an awkward rhythm for our students to get into, with units kind of ending in the middle of a day and starting a new unit. We have to do a lot of adaptation anyway. The other thing is that most of the time there's a sort of a final test or assessment at the end of each unit. When we use the textbook. Again, this is based on the assumption that we're going to be teaching in a semester. Whereas tests can play a very different role in the language schools. We don't necessarily need to have tests in our language development syllabi. We could have sort of daily check-ins or check-ins every once in a while. Maybe the tests are at the end of each week, which would sometimes cover, maybe 1.5 or 3 different units. And so we have to create our own assessments and kind of adapt. It can be an awkward fit over the textbook. The learning goals are a little bit different. So often the learning goals that are assumed for a textbook is that you're learning this language for tourism purposes or you're a college student. What this means is that textbook designs tend to be over-focused on transactions, wayfinding in a city, or giving directions, or buying food, purchasing things, booking lodging. Most of the time these days, these functions, these transactional functions, are all carried out with a combination of English or technology apps that have multilingual support based in. It's just not as important to learners' needs as it used to be maybe 20 years ago, because of the advances in technology and the increased willingness of people in many parts of the world to use English for simple transactional purposes. I often find that textbooks are under-focused on relationships. Because of the publication process, what gets into a textbook is often pretty anodyne. It's kind of pretty banal. What our learners are more invested in is really relationships, emotions, critical issues, dilemmas, conflicts, fears, hopes, dreams, like building connections. And so part of the reason that textbooks have like an underdevelopment on relationships is just because the realities of publishing means a lot of that stuff gets washed out or blanched out in the publishing process. Another sort of mismatch is that often a textbook unit will sort of put together the development, the language for skills development, vocabulary development, grammar development, together with content, artworks, literature, culture notes. The culture notes are actually often sometimes delivered in English. And that's all kind of integrated in a way which isn't exactly a good fit for the way that we carve up our curriculum at the language schools. Also, of course, textbook authors are going to not assume that we have the co-curriculum that we do in the language schools, where we do have the co-curriculum. So we can integrate that in, like the kinds of practice that learners will be doing in their co-curriculum, or the kinds of topics they'll be engaging with, makes textbooks not exactly perfect for our language schools context. Another reason that I think textbooks can be a mismatch with our language schools population. Noted on the previous slide that currently only 44% of the learners in our immersion program in our language development courses are undergrads. That's way down from what it used to be 20, 25 years ago. we have more and more adults, working adults, more and more graduate students, although the graduate student number actually isn't increasing. The only number that's really increasing is working adults and retirees. But textbooks tend to move on a grammatical syllabus. So they're going to be telling the learners exactly which grammar forms they're going to be quote unquote covering in a unit. Now we know from language acquisition studies that just because you introduce a grammar structure in a unit doesn't mean that it's acquired. And sometimes, in fact, the structures that are being taught are really kind of at a mismatch with the level of proficiency development that the learners are at. Maybe it's okay for them to recognize these structures, but to hold them accountable to using them is a challenge. So you can see in these 2 units from a German textbook, there's a list of grammar structures kind of grouped around the topics of on a trip and a step into the future. Now, if we were going to do a functional syllabus instead, and this is missing from almost every single textbook, instead of listing the grammar structures we're sort of covering in a unit, what the learners care more about is what are the core communicative functions. So actually, I know that at this point in the German class, my learners should be at an intermediate low. Maybe a few of them will have reached an intermediate mid, but mostly intermediate low level. So I can actually ask and come up with what would be intermediate low appropriate functions that learners could be carrying out around this theme. And these functions are actually great. These functions actually help lead me to designing my own activities, to designing interaction activities, to designing practice activities, real-world pedagogical tasks with my learners. And this is actually a much better way to drive the curriculum forward than the grammatical syllabus, which drives most textbooks forward. So instead of teaching the grammar structures, we could really highlight what are the main functions we're going to be practicing or working on in a chapter, because that's what learners most care about. There may be learners who actually don't want to go on a trip to Germany, or if they do, they're going to be planning that mostly in English. But they do care about the functions of comparing and choosing, describing and recommending, or recounting past travel experiences. So again, learners relate more to the functions than to topics and structures. So for chapter 10 or for chapter 11 about traveling or about plans for the future, these learning objectives, these can-do statements, which come from the actual proficiency guidelines, could be presented to learners at the beginning of each unit, both to orient their action, but also to hold me as the teacher and hold themselves accountable to whether or not they can actually accomplish these things at the end of their work in the unit. If I have these topics and I say, what are the best fit functions with intermediate low, I can actually get this sort of information and come up with some, again, basic bullet points for chapters 10 and 11. Now, this was all done with the help of a custom AI, which we'll talk about in the second part of today's presentation. But this is really helpful if I don't know how to do this at the fingertips. The AIs that have been pre-programmed with this kind of knowledge can really help us identify useful functions. Of course, I can tweak them or edit them later, which might be useful as I'm teaching the course. Again, although many textbooks are driven by a grammatical syllabus, that we're moving from grammar point to grammar point throughout. And by the way, not all of the grammar points actually match up with what we know about language development. For the German language, which I teach, there's a pretty good kind of list of structures that could be expected to be acquired at the intermediate low or the intermediate high levels. And I noticed that those are often a mismatch with the structures that are taught in a textbook. The other thing is about the themes. So the themes on a trip or a step into the future, these really assume things about my learners, and it's often the themes which drive what gets taught in these textbooks. This means that I'm going to teach all of the words about traveling or being on a trip, even if those words are really infrequent, or even if they're words that you're not really going to use because you might be carrying out these tasks in English if you were actually in Germany, at least in the early phases of your learning. And the themes may not apply. So this chapter 11, A Step into the Future, what's covered is careers and job postings and applications. Again, that makes sense if you're teaching this class to all undergraduates, but for the kind of learners that we have, they may not really care about how to find a job, doing job applications. We'd have to know our learners well and kind of ask them questions. But it's actually better once you have the functions, the functions that were on the previous page, 10, 11, ask for information, describe travel plans, compare choices, describe future plans, discuss possibilities. Those functions could be practiced across a wide variety of topics. And if the learners themselves are able to brainstorm the topics within which they want to practice these functions, we can actually do that. So I can pick something like best ideas from the German speaking world, or places that seem important for understanding German history or German culture or something. And they can each pick out a different topic, or they can pick something that's of interest to themselves, or something like the best job you've ever had, or the job you would most want to have, and pick that. So kind of refine the vocabulary that's presented, that's practiced in the textbook, and actually make it kind of come alive, give the opportunities to personalize it for the things that they really care about. If a lot of times curriculum designers will actually just use the functions and proficiency levels and may not even pre-pick the topics, allowing students themselves as a group to decide what topics they're interested in covering, but then we practice those functions with their own choice of topics. So we can use all of this information to help us create our own material. So I've been talking about ways that textbooks are not always the best fit, but creating our own materials takes a lot of time. And I do want to say, if you in a level or language want to design your own materials, we have ability to help support you in that work. If that's something that you would like to do, is to design curriculum that really is a good fit for this particular context and for your particular learners. It can be an effortful process though. So this table here comes from our Spanish level 3, the curriculum that they developed, and all of the things that they have for the different units. So you notice there's 6 units which match the 6 weeks of instruction. The 7th week is for final projects, for proficiency assessments, and kind of wrap up. And they have very nice progressions for these 6 units, which really match the language school's context. And they've thoughtfully chosen materials, they've thoughtfully chosen practices that really match the place in which they're learning Spanish, which is in Middlebury, Vermont. So I'd like you to get into the breakout rooms, and we can talk about what is driving the syllabus in our course, or to think about it if you're watching this as a recording. In the course that you have, is it a development from really theme to theme? First maybe family, then the house, or is it kind of a theme of like environment, politics? Is it grammar is really the thing that's driving your syllabus forward, grammar structure by grammar structure by grammar structure, that you're stacking them up? Is it clear to the learners what the functions are? Are they going to really see how they move from function to function to function to function as they go through the summer, and what functions are going to be practiced in each of the modules? Maybe something else. And I'd like you to also discuss or think about, what are the felt tensions between your materials, the materials that you've chosen to use or were asked to use, and the needs of your learners at the language schools?